I had a rather difficult task today. There's a 600 and something page book by Dr. Jeremy Malcolm, who some of you might know, who works with Consumers International, and but prior to his life at Consumers International, he was a PhD student, and his PhD thesis was on internet governance and multi-stakeholderism, and specifically about looking at the Internet Governance Forum that grew out of a process called the World Summit on Information Society. Now, as I was preparing for this, I realized there's no way possible for me to cover a 650-page book in even half an hour or so. So what I'll do is I'll kind of give an outline of, I'll give an introduction to the book, and then I'll provide an outline of what he discusses in the book. And I'll talk a little bit about, in greater detail about what his main contribution, I think, to the field is. So this book has 11 pages of acronyms. Okay, that tells you a little bit about this field, about internet governance, as something that is a complex mix of both the technical, okay, and which gives rise to all these acronyms, and a kind of insular field that it has really become, where the only folks who are really involved in internet governance at the supranational level are those folks who are comfortable with all these acronyms. And that's quite unfortunate, but that's the state of affairs right now. He starts off by talking about how the internet came about, right? About the hacker ethos that went into it, about how even though it actually came out of a governmental process, but how that is not what really defined the internet. One of the definitional moments of the internet happens in 1994, not in the 1960s, but in 1994, when something called BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol, comes about. And looking around the room right now, I realize that not a single person from the 2009 talk on BGP that we had in our office is in the room, and even Sunil, you weren't there in that talk. So it's quite unfortunate, but let me just say that BGP is what changes the internet into something that is decentralized. And the decentralization of the internet is what gives rise to all this talk about governance and all these difficulties that we have in thinking about governance with the internet. Because this form of decentralization is not something we're currently very used to. Because over the past many centuries, if anything, we have had more and more centralization, perhaps at different places, but that's what the nation state is. It's a kind of melding of different forms of governance into one entity of the nation state. But to state another problem right up front, which is that of the Internet Governance Forum. Now, most of you here are aware that we at CIS, we take part in this forum, which no one is sure what it is, whether it's a process, whether it is a place, whether it is a meeting, what exactly it is, but we take part in it. Now, one of the central issues about the IGF is that of legitimacy, of anything, of can it make any kinds of decisions, etc., etc. So I'll just read out something from the book. It says, the IGF's output is explicitly non-binding, which means that the participation of states in the IGF process does not involve the use of coercive power as a typical feature of government regulation. In some definitions of law, coercive power is at the heart of the definition of what makes for law. He says, in fact, since the process is to be multilateral, multi-stakeholder, democratic and transparent, with full involvement of all stakeholders involved in this process, governments do not, at least in principle, enjoy any position of preeminence in policy formation through the IGF. Neither should they if the IGF's legitimacy and effectiveness are to be assured. Now this last bit, neither should they if the IGF's legitimacy and effectiveness are to be assured, is what this book is all about. Okay, I find this because the central part of this book is about governance processes, about the different forms of governance that exist, that people, humans being ingenious creatures, that we've tried out, and where they work, where they don't work. So it goes a lot into political theory. But apart from that, I find this book very useful, apart from that contribution, okay, which is the central focus, because of the great amount of historical information and rich amount of the excellent research that Jeremy Malcolm has done that goes into this book. So even if you aren't really concerned about questions of of different forms of governance, etc., that can apply, and how in different measures they can apply to the internet and those kinds of issues, I would highly recommend this book. Just for this chapter he has on these chapters, this chapter he has on internet governance as it was, okay, which goes into technical coordination, standards development, and public policy governance, and the governance mechanisms that have been tried out. Okay, and this going on from at least from the late 80s to 2008. Okay, it's a brilliant encapsulation as any other that exists, and I would say even better in some respects for the amount of detail that he goes into of this field. So historically, for anyone who wants to get up to date, and this is something I recommended for, I remember when Elle and I went to the IGF, this is a book that I reread just before going to the last IGF, and particularly this one chapter. Okay. And yeah, so the bulk of the book is around justifying the statement that if the IGF's legitimacy and effectiveness are to be assured, state shouldn't be at the center. But this is a different book from those, for instance, written by Milton Mueller, who also pursues that central formulation. Milton Mueller believes in network governance as that network governance should be the primary form of governance for the internet. Jeremy Malcolm wouldn't quite agree with that, and I have also some disagreements with Milton Mueller on that. But just to get a little bit into this, he starts from there to justify this statement. He goes into discussions of how the internet came out of the government-run project, but in fact, and this is there are some articles about this that I can circulate, a lot was contributed to the internet by corporations. Now, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal last year or was it Forbes, that tried to claim that the internet was primarily shaped by corporations, and that went a little bit too far, trying to make the argument that the decisions made by AT&T in the 1980s are what made the internet what it is. And well, in part, those did contribute quite a bit, but that isn't what defined the internet. Things like BGP, for instance, didn't come out of corporations, didn't come out of states. Okay, BGP can, in many respects, be seen to be defining the internet. Yet that doesn't, because it makes the internet without a core, that came independently of states. So when we're talking about stakeholders, it's not necessary that that technical stakeholders, for instance, have to be identified with corporations. Okay, because technical stakeholders have contributed a great amount to the internet, while being independent both from civil society in a sense, at least the public policy formulation parts of civil society, and corporations. It's a separate question whether when they go to policy formulation bodies, okay, which are multi-stakeholder, whose interest do they represent is a separate question perhaps. But in terms of contributions, I think they can be seen separately. And that's a question that Sunil in the past has raised. It goes into talking about a contrast between John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which some of you might have heard me talk about earlier, and the formulation by this gentleman from the ITU, who talks about it's only a historical anomaly that governments aren't at the center of internet governance. Because he says, imagine the situation where if governments didn't want the internet to actually propagate, they are in a position to physically prevent that. Okay? And if you want some kind of effectiveness in internet governance, you have to have governments playing the central role. Now, there is somewhere in between these where John Perry Barlow rejects governments as ye weary something of flesh and blood, right? And this central role allocated to governments, and which is where Jeremy Malcolm locates himself. And the one exception to this completely decentralized being of the internet is something called the domain name system. Okay, this is the system that allows yahoo.com to be typed out as an address rather than a complex numerical address. Okay, now this system is centralized. Right, since 1998 it's been in the joint control of something called IANA and ICANN. And eventually both ICANN and IANA have a contract with the NTIA, which is part of the Department of Commerce of the US government. Okay, and this has historically, at least till 2005, been at the heart of the debate around internet governance. This system of naming and numbering. And frankly, I think it's a foolish fight. Okay, it really doesn't matter. There are alternatives that exist right now. I can access web addresses that other people can't access if they are using just the DNS server provided by your ISP. It's a matter of 30 seconds. All you have to do to be able to access things like .cake, okay, which right now doesn't exist, but does exist in some other place, in an alternate naming system like Alternic, or etc., etc. It takes 30 seconds to change what is called the DNS server. Okay, so fundamentally changing the internet actually is not that difficult. Okay, yet people have put this one small issue at the heart of the debate around the internet for a long time. And this has been done both by the Europeans and by the rest of the world, because the US has been in control. The more I think about it, the more I feel that the Europeans got it right when they moved on from it. Okay, the Brits, for instance, no longer really care about this. And they might actually have gotten it right because this is a small, petty fight that doesn't really have that larger ramification, yet has been put at the core of internet governance. And this is what most of the fights through the late 90s, leading up to the World Summit on Information Society process were about. And I won't go into right now, because I want to talk a little bit more about the book. I won't go into why this fight is meaningless. I've given an example already, but yeah. Just to move on, he also points out that technologies that won out weren't necessarily those that had commercial backing. Okay, and the internet is just technologies put together, standards put together. Okay, and so it's not necessarily that governments have played a crucial central role, and not even the commercially backed stuff that has actually gone on to become the core of the internet now. But there are, of course, exceptions. Okay, sometimes closed source stuff like Flash, and for those of you who have gray hair, you would remember ActiveX, okay, which was a important technology in the late 90s, early 2000s for the World Wide Web. No one remembers about it, but for a bit it was quite dominant, as Flash later went on to be as well, right? So there's that. So sometimes markets do prefer, do give dominance to closed source stuff as well. So it's not necessarily necessary that markets always choose the open standard and open source stuff. Okay, and he then moves on to governance mechanisms, and he says that it's clear that there is need for governance mechanisms, even if it is just self-governance. Okay, and quoting someone else, he says, the question is no longer whether cyberspace as a whole can or should be regulated, but whether and to what extent individual problem areas within particular cyberspaces can or should be addressed via regulation. And I think you folks should also get like lunch perhaps while I'm talking. Or, yeah. And then he goes on to, should I pause or are you folks happy to?
More people should get some lunch.
Yeah. No one wants lunch? Okay. Like if no one wants lunch, then I'll continue for another 10 minutes.
Can you just serve it, please? Yeah.
Okay. So he goes on. He looks at different people who looked at forms of governance, right? He looks at how Beagle separates it out into legal, international cooperation, and architecture. Lessig separates it out into laws, markets, social norms, and code. Riedenberg, in an, I think 92 article called Lex Informatica, looks at it as primarily about the architecture, technology, code, like all of them as one thing. That Lex Informatica is what actually. So he kind of predates Lessig in talking about code as law. And then Koeman talks about self-governance, co-governance, hierarchical governance. So you can see it's not only in terms of the features of governance, which is like laws, markets, social norms, codes, etc., but also the implications such as self-governance. So different people have analyzed this in different ways. Carlson Analytics looks at it as rules, which break down into national law, international law, and creation of a new global body as a possibility. Vedel looks at community governance, market governance, hierarchical / state regulation, associative regulation, which is kind of governance by networks. These are like voluntary agreements between stakeholder groups, which might need state intervention. And Vedel believes they do require state intervention, either at the design stage or in the application stage. Malcolm goes through all of these and then looks at for him the formulation of rules, norms, markets, architecture, and networks. These are the 5 that he sees governance as being about. Okay, so I'll just quickly run through these and then just kind of read out the rest of the chapter heading so that you know what it's about. Okay, so rules would be stuff like the Information Technology Act, like the ways of that, like the Can-Spam Act in the US, etc. All these, traditional statutes, etc., rules that apply on networks. Then you have norms. The most classical example of norms would be the request for comments RFC 1855, which is the RFC on netiquette. Okay, this is the technical document, and just search for RFC 1855 and you'll find it, which talks about things like how you shouldn't write something in all caps unless you want to be shouting, and about simple things like that. Which there's this moment in 1990. Most people put it down to 1998 September or so when the internet changes. Okay, this is when like a kind of closed group of people, okay, becomes like because thanks to the World Wide Web, thanks to the collapse of AOL, its closed network, etc., becomes a large, like becomes the unwashed masses. Okay, and they don't know these things that the people who've always lived on the internet and have been on it through closed networks, etc. No. Now, so things like netiquette perhaps do have an important role there, but there are other kinds of things as well. Norms around spam. Malcolm goes into this interesting example about the first spammer in the world, okay, and how their spam actually had offline consequences, where people, jammed their telephone networks and physically went and visited them to complain about it, etc. And countered spam with more mail spam to them and things like that. That it can have offline consequences as well, ignoring internet norms. That to me seems like that might seem like an interesting anomaly when we look these many years down the line from 1906 or something. But think about this. Some of you might have read about the interesting episode of Adrian Chen from Gawker, exposing the guy who is like Violent Acres on Reddit, right? For being posting what he thought was close to child pornography, etc., and pictures without consent of people, etc. Now, in that also I see as a way of actually imposing internet etiquette. Okay. And I think it's quite, and I think the role of norms, and even in this book, Malcolm doesn't go, this is like one of the shortest parts when he looks at these different forms. And I think the role of norms is something that is underexplored. Okay, and I think because what we have in the form of politeness isn't actually a rule, but when you hear Kapil Sibal talking about people being rude to women online and how you can't be fine with that, okay, Kapil Sibal, our minister, is talking about it in terms of legal regulation. We don't generally regulate, impose norms through legal regulation. There are areas where the application of norms and law can coincide. Things like spam are, very easy examples of that. There are norms against spam, and there are legal regulations also sometimes against spam. Things like stalking, etc. Most laws, in fact, come out of norms of different sorts. Okay? Things like cyber stalking, things like cyberbullying, etc. Okay? Now, in most jurisdictions, they don't have laws that regulate this. Right now, there are norms about it. People call each other out sometimes. There are places on the internet where these kinds of norms perhaps don't apply, where their statement, where their motto is, if it is legal, it stays. Okay? Even if you're, greatly discomforted by it. So there are hundreds of these gore sites. There are some of these things go from being gore and like from being very impactful to becoming jokes even at times. Okay, well, some of you might know about Goatse, okay, which at one point in time was, in my opinion, the starting of one of the first things that kicked off the proliferation of disgusting things on the internet becoming very popular. But Goatse in time has become a joke, right? So these things also change with time. But the role of norms is something that is very underexplored in my opinion. People and politicians and policymakers especially don't get this. They want certain norms but see laws as the necessary answer rather than norms by themselves being a form of governance. Right? Then I'm actually going to speed through this. I'm sorry. Markets. Malcolm talks about how markets how how the internet brings us closer, in a sense, to free markets than anything before. Uh, Information symmetry is so much better now than without the internet. You can find out about the prices of things. You can compare prices so much more easily now than ever before. You can buy things from other places. Okay, so traditional commerce really has, changed because of the internet, because of decreasing information asymmetry in ways, etc. So we might actually, many of the classic theories about why free markets don't work as they're supposed to, etc., are centered around these ideas of information asymmetry that the internet actually does help resolve. But there still are various kinds of market failures. And he says while the market can work really well in things like domain names and domain name purchasing and reallocation even perhaps, which is something that Milton Mueller is really big on right now. And not domain names, sorry. Milton Mueller is also looking interestingly at IP address block reallocation through market mechanisms. Okay, but there are still lots of externalities, etc., that right now we don't have good market mechanisms to help solve. Spam, for instance, could be something that the market could theoretically get into, but we're not going to make email a sender-pays system. Okay, that's just not going to happen. And so, realistically speaking, the market can't help spam, okay, unless we change the way we deal with email. Okay. Costs are borne by the recipients. The costs of spam right now are borne by the recipients. Things that the market can't help, or isn't really helping right now. Developing countries' concerns about internet access, privacy, etc., aren't things that the market can really help. And then he looks at architecture. I'm kind of skipping through this, I'm sorry, it's getting a bit late, so I'll take around 7 more minutes. Architecture. He looks at things like anonymity as being, something that is much more easy online than offline, and I tend to agree to an extent. With the internet, anonymity is much easier. In an intranet, on the other hand, security being given a higher pedestal, you'd want to know what every single computer on your intranet is doing. Okay, he looks at anti-censorship, etc. But there are issues. It requires knowledge, and this is something that Malcolm doesn't go into. It requires knowledge to know how to circumvent censorship online. Okay, so while it might be easy to say that I'm forgetting the exact word, but that the internet sees censorship as an impediment and just as damage and just routes around it. Okay, but still, to do that, it requires some amount of knowledge. Okay, and you need to know how to circumvent censorship, even though it's possible. And this of course can lead to things that we might not want, darknets that are completely unregulated. And when you're thinking about regulation, don't think just about censorship. Think about things like taxation as well. Okay, so if there is an entire economy that one of the core features of modern tax systems is simplification, so that you can get more and more transactions within the thing that is taxed. Okay, that is one of the things behind VAT, for instance, in trying to maximize collections by changing the structure. But when you have things like darknets, when you have an entire place where commerce can happen without being visible at all, okay, then you do have a tax problem. Now, some governments might, of course, in all economies you do have untaxed stuff, but will more and more of that shift here? It's possible, and with things like bitcoins, okay, where even that linkage sometimes to the offline in terms of electronic, being dependent on the offline for electronic currency. Okay, being dependent on the MasterCards and the Visas and the PayPals, etc. Even that linkage is cut. Okay, so it is increasingly possible to just be offline be online and to live online in a way that wasn't possible 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Okay, so this is this is the core of what I said in a recent meeting, recent panel discussion in Paris for the UNESCO thing, was that the same design choices that we're making to ensure greater easier opposition to censorship, those same design choices go on to hurt privacy. And I gave examples of how that actually happens. Okay, so we have to realize that architecture isn't a simple thing of, yeah, let's promote free speech, let's promote privacy, let's promote all these things that we care about. No, there are actual conflicts at places that we have to deal with, and those and he comes and I'd add also there are sometimes bad decisions that you have to live with. For instance, at one point of time, encryption is more difficult and more computationally expensive. Okay, and so certain decisions have been made, which later on make it difficult to have more and more encryption. And now things are slowly changing. Now the W3C is looking into encryption as well, and building, and this right now there's a process of a new standard being created for that, etc. But Malcolm concludes saying architecture is of its very nature, therefore, only an effective tool of governance in those areas in which governance is least needed. Okay, coming back to the governance issue. Then lastly, he looks at networks. Networks aren't something really new. Offline networks have existed for a long time. There are government networks of national regulators, for instance. There are business networks which sometimes emerge as lobby organizations. Even something like the International Labour Organization, which includes not just states but private parties as well as a core part of the organization and is still part of the UN. That can also, to an extent, be seen as networks. Okay, but Malcolm is more interested in multi-stakeholder networks which involve governance. So he doesn't go into all of these in too much detail. He looks at things that existed before the IGF, which is one model of multi-stakeholder network involving governments. So he looks at the Global Knowledge Partnership, etc., and says those can also exist. He concludes saying the Tunis agenda got things wrong in paragraph 35, in which it, and this is a conflict that exists within the Tunis agenda itself. Again, this is quite fascinating. Okay, where in paragraph 35 it says it does to an extent give pride of position to governments when it says that public policy, where it says that there are multiple stakeholders in the process of internet governance, and each stakeholder has its role, and it identifies public policy as a role of government. Whereas that's actually what the fight is about, that public policy is something that all stakeholders contribute to, that technical decisions are also part of public policy. Okay, and that the Tunis agenda gets this wrong is something that many people actually agree with. Now, one very interesting example, and that goes on to the issue of legitimacy of the IGF to an extent, right? And the legitimacy of the multi-stakeholder model as well. One interesting thing that came out in the Sharm el-Sheikh IGF, I'm forgetting who organized this workshop, but there was a session around network governance, at which Wikipedia was one of the primary examples used, okay, of a self-governing kind of system. Like, so people are out there imagining a combination of the Internet Engineering Task Force with Wikipedia and as being a way that the Internet could self-regulate. Now, I think that's a bit of utopianism to an extent. Things have been tried. If you look at, we have a book in our library by Tim Wu and Eric Goldman called Who Controls the Net? who controls the net, and in which they go into the cyber steward, not cyber steward, sorry. They go into the cyber sheriff's model that emerged in 97 or 98 or so around eBay, okay, where they did, in comparison to the Wild West, saying that if we can have individuals who are respected within the community being the moderators or being the sheriffs, okay, why can't we try that online? That eventually failed, okay, because they realized that the moment online activities can have offline repercussions, but the authority of that online moderator doesn't extend offline, that you have a problem, and that is part of the issue with imagining this utopian world. But you can take many parts of this utopian combination of the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Internet and Wikipedia governance models, etc., which really are grounds up models, okay, and see how we can find a larger place for them while not replacing all other forms of governance. Okay, so he looks at, and this is the best part about the book, right? So I'm just describing right now the introduction to the larger book and giving a kind of overview. But throughout all of this, he goes into a great amount of detail about the functioning of the Internet Engineering Task Force or W3C ICANN, how they came about in each case, of the great amount of politics in it, which I think is necessary for you to understand what the hell is going on right now, etc. And one other thing about the idea of rough consensus and working code, okay, which is the IETF model, is that he says, perhaps is it possible that it's only suitable to largely technical organizations where objectivity and derivation from principles is easier, right? So and the realization that now there is no netizens. While when ICANN came about, there was a group called At Large. There still is a group, one section within ICANN called At Large, which is supposed to represent netizens at large. Now, there is no netizens at large, and that there is no one coherent group, right? Now, how do you resolve that conflict? He quotes, I'm forgetting who, but says, "We have to accept that every consensus exists as a temporary result of a provisional hegemony, as a stabilization of power, and that it always entails some form of exclusion. The idea that power could be dissolved through a rational debate and that legitimacy could be based on pure rationality are illusions which can endanger democratic institutions." Now, this is true even in the UN. Kofi Annan, for instance, recognizes that there is a similar problem, that consensus has become an aim in itself, and that bargaining is the main thing happening, not deliberation, not democratic deliberation. Okay, now I'll end here and just kind of run through the chapter headings of the book. So he goes through internet governance as it was, looking at technical coordination, historical development, current arrangements, etc., criticisms, standards development, public policy governance, governance mechanisms as they currently exist, the international system. He looks, and it's a really good thing that Jeremy Malcolm's a lawyer also. So so he does, to an extent, understand international law quite decently. So looks at international law and international relations, looks at the different actors, the government, the private sector, civil society, and what he calls the new medievalism, looks at different sources of international law and how they can work together. And this is an area that I really want to do more research myself, and the limitations of international law in terms of legitimacy, jurisdiction, universality, etc. Now, internet governance as law is a concept that he looks at the end of that chapter. But and here, what folks have been thinking about in terms of jurisdiction, etc., are really explored in much greater detail, because that's the greatest affront of the internet to traditional nation states. And then he looks, and this is the core of his original contribution to the field, which is designing a governance network. And some of you who might have seen a new article he wrote around 4 weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago, might see that he's trying to take this and kind of simplify it and has proposals for how we can move on from the IGF. So he looks at anarchistic governance as a network organization model, and the internet looks at hierarchies, looks at bureaucracy, oligarchy, meritocracy, hybrid models, etc. And democratic networks, and goes into different issues of representation, consent, transparency, inclusion, etc. Then consensual models, and talks about some of the issues I spoke about earlier in terms of the problems with that. But he believes that that's finally what it has to boil down to. Consensual governance models through deliberative consensus is what he kind of pushes. Okay, then he goes into, and this is also quite fantastic, reform of internet governance. So he goes through what happened through the World Society on Information Society process, World Summit on Information Society process, which is continuing right now with the review meetings, and the first of which happened in Paris 2 weeks ago, which I'd gone to for UNESCO, held by UNESCO. Goes through the first phase, the second phase, the Geneva Declaration, the Tunis Agenda, and he really has a good grip, even though he wasn't there for some of it. Is a really good grip of the politics that went into that. The IGF, he's been at every IGF since the first one, and that's the core of his study. Okay, and then looks at regional initiatives, including the Brazilian one, and looks at other proposals that have since come up. And this is also very useful because he reviews a lot of the existing literature, specifically around internet governance. Then looks specifically at what kinds of reforms to the IGF are needed as well in this. And then there's this one large chapter about the IGF, about how it's performed, about goes into a lot of the politics of it, about the role of Nitin Desai, of the role of Marcus Kumar, and the other folks who helmed this process, and yeah, so, and then comes to a conclusion about what kinds of reforms the IGF needed, and that's a short summary of which took me around 31 minutes. This is a book. It's a very rich book, I think, very useful for a good introduction, and I hope that was useful. Any other questions you might have, do ask. Oh, and the book is available for free online. You can just download a copy. If you just search for, I'll give you the title. It is Multi-Stakeholder Governance and the Internet Governance Forum, Jeremy Malcolm. You'll come to a PDF called igfbook.pdf, and yeah, you can just download that. It should be accessible because he created in tech. So, oh, this version, no, sorry. Okay, hold on. Okay, you might have to ask him for an accessible version, which I'm sure he'll have, because this version was created in Mac with the Quartz PDF thing in Mac, which isn't generally accessible. So I'll just ask him. He has a text of it anyhow, so he can send that across.
So we just hope that it's possible that there's some form of centralization within internet governance, some type of subtle form of centralization, like information leads, for example. I mean, I know that governance, generally speaking, is rather decentralized because there are corporations, governments, and agencies handling data. But then, in the end of the day, isn't there some type of elite or some type of individuals behind the network, possibly controlling data?
So,
surveillance.
I'm not quite sure how to answer your question with respect to data and surveillance. Okay, but
well, internet governance in general, considering the fact that internet governance is very highly linked to data mining, data control.
So that the latter part of it relating to data mining, data control is I'm not quite sure, but how to fit into this into my response. But to tackle your question about the elite, Okay, now let's, and specifically looking at networks, okay, that are often praised. Okay, looking at the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Architecture Board, Internet Society, which are all kind of interlinked. There's this brilliant chart in the book which everyone should study, okay, to really get a grasp over it. 1 second, let me just show you this. Where he does an important kind of mapping out of internet governance organizations, looking at ISOC, Internet Architecture Board, NTIA, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the Internet Association for Numbering and something, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Research Task Force, the Internet Engineering Study Group, areas, working groups of that, the RFC editor, the RSG research groups, the GNSO, which is a generic numbers something organization, the CCNSO, and etc. etc. Okay, so this is very valuable. Now these are the examples of the core technical management of the internet, especially. Okay, now, and these are what are praised. Saying, why can't we just apply this to the internet public policy writ large? Right? If you look at how many women, for instance, are on the Internet Architecture Board, there are precisely 2 women, one of whom is honorary and one of whom was elected. Okay, there are no people outside of Western Europe and North America. So there are no people of color from either of these 2 regions either. Okay.
How do you know?
Because I went through the members and
Current snapshot,
yeah,
not historical.
not historically. I'm looking at current, and these actually don't change all that much, interestingly enough. Okay, and here's the thing. It's important to recognize that this is, in a sense, like Wikipedia, pre-Wikipedia itself, in that the rules for this haven't been set by any one particular person or organization. This is, in a sense, the internet, netizens, whatever that might be, deciding that this is how elections to the Internet Architecture Board should happen. Okay. So anyone can contribute to this process. It's a mailing list. Okay. Now, it's a different matter that now it's a bit settled. That for new people to come in, like for Sarvajit Roy to come in now, okay, and to say that, wait a second, this, what you guys are doing has been all wrong for 20 years, this might be difficult. But this is actually something that has come out of a particular kind of process. But does it result in something that's inclusive, or has the process been inclusive? No, in both cases. Okay. So, so yes, there is a kind of elite. If you hang around different mailing lists, and I think this is fascinating, even for folks who aren't, techies, just hanging out at different mailing lists run by IETF and IESG and IRSG, etc. Okay. Many of them are quite dormant, many very low volume. Some of them have, but you can see the dynamics of how some decisions are made. Okay. Now, for instance, going through why the current mail system, IMAP, okay, is the internet mail. Sorry.
Internet mail extension.
No. Address protocol.
Yeah.
Internet mail address protocol. Okay. Not address. Sorry. Mail something protocol. Okay. Sorry.
Mail access protocol.
Mail access protocol. Okay. Now that is technically deficient in some ways. Okay. But a person trying to change it, okay, is facing a lot of problems. Okay, because the person who actually authored the IMAP, was the primary author of IMAP, is saying no. Okay, you can't make these changes, and despite there actually being good technical reasons for those changes to be made, and authority. Okay, and here's the thing: that one of the core rules is that we don't believe in kings voting, or king something or voting Okay, we work by rough consensus and running code. Okay, that's the credo of things like ITF. Yet you see that's not really what necessarily works out in practice. Okay, it's a happy thing that everyone who wants to argue against states and against corporations, okay, can promote. Okay, say that here's the thing that we want instead. Okay, but that has its limitations, as all governance models have their limitations, and we should acknowledge them, I think, rather than just assuming that power operates somehow differently when it comes to internet-related, the I-star bodies. But I'm not sure whether that addresses your question.
Indirectly.
It does.
Are there any points in this book about how, like, previously organizations have all their data stored in-house, now it's probably going out to some cloud network provider, and so, or even websites where we don't really know where most of the data in the server, which country it's in, but then it may be illegal in some country where it's stored, and maybe illegal in another country where it's accessed.
A large chunk of this book actually deals with those kinds of issues. He goes a lot into issues of jurisdiction, he goes a lot into issues of control over data, etc., and goes a lot into consumer rights issues and how they've been tried to be solved and how some of them have been successful, some of them haven't. He goes, oh, this would be absolutely perfect for you, Maria. He goes a lot into the different kinds of privacy controls that different people have worked out from the 90s onwards. One of which caused a big fight between the EFF and other organizations, because EFF was actually backing something that others saw was pro-corporation. Okay, and it goes into all of these kinds of things that people have tried out and have failed, and about why they failed, etc. So and including issues of data control. Jeremy Malcolm actually spoke at a panel that I had organized on open standards in the cloud, okay, and why open standards are a very important part and an important missing part right now of many of current cloud infrastructure that's cropping up, okay, because that totally removes control from the hands of the users, okay, and puts in the hands of the providers. And so, so yeah, he has written about it in the past, and even in this book, well, this book predates the cloud terminology, okay, and it's popularized, but he does go into those issues in it.
So, suppose a new stakeholder wants to enroll themselves in a multi-stakeholder process, or an existing stakeholder wants to split into two, and how do they decide?
He looks at the NCUC, NCSG division in this book. How do they decide is, as I'm not quite sure how to
How many
answer.
stakeholders do you need for a multi-stakeholder process?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Now, the answer is different in every body, of course. Okay.
So if the multi-stakeholder fix is a process fix,
Yeah.
and if the process fix cannot answer any questions
Substance.
like this, if it cannot answer any
No,
questions like this, it's not a fix.
No. I do think it can, which is precisely the point of him looking at network governance and that entire chapter. So just have a look at that chapter, okay, if you want. And it can, because processes are never about just processes. They are built with some substantive issues also at their heart. Okay, so ICANN, for instance, can be seen as a process of resolving how you deal with DNS. Okay, a process of getting GTLDs out the door. It can be seen as a process. Now, why has ICANN, and he goes a lot into ICANN, which I think is great, because I didn't know about ICANN in this much detail before I read. Like, I don't think any other resource I've read, okay, goes into gives this much information about ICANN, for instance. But how they have branched out, okay, that doesn't really apply to the rest of the world. okay, the rest of internet governance. And the interesting thing is, one of the weirdest bits of ICANN is at large. Okay, and one other person to read through while thinking about this issue of stakeholders is Karl Orbach, okay, who was the first elected at-large representative. Okay, so at one point of time, and you might find this difficult to believe, there actually was an election, a worldwide election, in a manner of speaking, to elect a person to represent netizens at ICANN. Now, and that was this chap called Karl Orbach. Now, that eventually failed. Okay, and if you go to Karl's site called cavebear.net, okay, it's a rich resource for information about the early days of internet governance and how all of this happened. And he's a very sharp voice on this. He disagrees with pretty much everyone out there, and everyone disagrees very strongly with him. But it's good to read that kind of a critical voice. He also runs, for instance, an alternate DNS system, separate from ICANN. And he believes that having multiple such things, okay, is a positive thing, that ICANN shouldn't have a monopoly over DNS, which is recognized by state parties as well. So yeah, so he does go into in different essays on his site, and Jeremy also goes into he goes this deeply into political theory precisely to answer your question about how do we decide on representation, etc. And he goes a lot into ICANN to precisely answer these kinds of questions. So and shows that there are so in something you know well, the split between NCUC and NCSG, which are the non-commercial users constituency and the non-commercial something group, okay, stakeholders group, I think. Okay, now one becomes the non-commercial trademarks people, okay, and the other becomes the non-commercial non-trademark people. Okay, now there isn't a harm in having this kind of split in this group, in this one singular group meant for non-commercial stakeholders. Okay, so when you identify industry as a group, okay, now clearly on many issues, the interests of the telecoms vary from the interests of the people who use the network for the World Wide Web. Okay, the web service providers and the interests of the telecoms, both of them are clubbed within industry. There isn't a problem really in subdividing them and them self-organizing within that. Okay, and a further point to say that the current kind of distinction that you have isn't very useful is that who says that they don't work for the public interest? Do governments say that? No. Civil society is working for the public interest, that is their claim. Private industry, okay, says that they work in the private interest, but that helps further the public interest. That is, after all, what private industry is about. Okay. And there's no one who, and the technical bodies, etc., if they're identified as, so generally the fourth one which is identified in the Tunis agenda, etc., is intergovernmental organizations. Okay, so there are of course different documents, but 4 stakeholders within the Tunis agenda are governments, industry, civil society, and intergovernmental organizations. Okay, not technical organizations, etc., etc. Now, why should there be a distinction when there are very few intergovernmental organizations that aren't, just composed of governments as a sole stakeholder? I'm not very sure. That's a lot to do with politics. Okay? And that is something that Jeremy does go into in great detail in his book.
In which chapter?
There is one chapter in which he goes into, one second, designing a governance network, and he goes into the last one, okay, consensual, Okay, where he goes into into some amount of detail about stakeholder groups. Okay, and there is another bit where he talks of where he talks about the network model, okay, of governance, of network governance. That's another place where he talks about this, but mostly in the latter chapter. In terms of order. So. And he goes into how the particular stakeholder groups were seen in the chapter on WSIS as well, reform of internet governance. That's been long, and all of you have had lunch, and I've cut into the next workshop right now downstairs as well. I'm sorry. So.
I should thank Sneshish for forcing me to do this.
Thank you, Sneshish.
Applause for Sneshish.